We can't tell you how frustrating it was for us to upload our podcast when we first got started. The websites were clunky, we had data limits, and it was all so confusing. That is, until we found Zencastr. Zencastr is an online platform built for podcasters to not only upload their podcasts, track their listeners, connect their audience, and so much more. Zencastr plans have no upload or download limits, so your cost won't grow as you do. Embed their player that automatically updates to show the latest episode of your show. Zencastr lets you see your podcast downloads along with your traffic, website, and Google Analytics. Zencastr also supports multiple podcasts under one account. The best part is, if you already have a podcast on another platform, you can switch to Zencastr with a one-click importer, all free of charge. So what are you waiting for? Head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/Zencastr to start saving time and money with your podcast today. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of How to Make a Podcast. My name is Nick Miller, and this week we have something special for you to listen to, something special for your ear holes, and that is that I am joined by my good friend, our editor, who edits all of our podcasts, both this one and the How to Film Weddings one, a good friend of mine, and that is Mr. Blake Pollino. Blake, how are you doing today?
Man, I'm great. It's great to see you, great to chat, great to be on this awesome podcast. Yeah, man, just excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you bet. So John is taking the week off. He had some personal stuff going on that I don't want to get into. And, I was getting ready to put this. We're doing a Q&A episode today. I was getting ready to put this all together, and I thought, you know what? I don't want to just ramble by myself for like half an hour. So I got Blake on here so that he could ramble with me,
Yes.
and maybe make some better points than I can make, because Blake is he's very knowledgeable and has some really good insights. So Blake, you do edit our podcasts and you're involved in some other stuff. So why don't you kind of give our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do and what your activity is in the podcasting world?
Yeah, so I also own a wedding film company, just like John and Nick. So I met John and Nick a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, and at a wedding filmmaking workshop that John and Nick were hosting. So I met the two of them there. So first off, I'm a podcast freak, and I have been for like the last probably 10 years. So I was really early. It sounds really hipsterish to say, like I was into podcasts before they were cool, right? Is that even a cool thing to say? Like the whole hipster thing? But are hipsters still a thing? So anyway, I've been in a podcast for a long time. Basically, any waking second of the day that I'm not actively doing something, I'm listening to a podcast. It's one of my favorite forms of media. Always has been. So I started listening to the How to Film Weddings podcast that you and John started, and was a big fan of that. Was messaging with you guys, connecting with you. We met at the workshop. And it started to grow, and it got busy enough that you guys started looking for an editor. And I was like, hey, guys, I love podcasts. I listen to every episode. Why don't you let me edit the podcast for you? So that started a really big snowball for me into the podcast world. So I have the wedding film company. I also have a commercial video production company. And a real estate photo and video company. But under the video production company, we've started doing podcast production. So we started, once I kind of got my feet wet with How to Film Weddings, and we started to really start to roll with that, and things started taking off. I guess I joined on episode like 32, something like that, and now we're 130 plus deep, whatever it is. So I really started to see behind the curtain of the podcast world that I had been a big fan of for a decade. So I looked at the business and started to not necessarily actively seek, but look for opportunities where we could produce podcasts for people outside of How to Film Weddings and How to Make a Podcast. So we started producing and editing or editing. Some of them we produce from the beginning. Some of them we just edit podcasts about a little over a year ago for other companies and other brands. So we are now either producing and or editing 9 different podcasts. 7 of those are weekly podcasts that get released every single week. So 2 of those are yours. Mm-hmm. And then this opportunity with How to Make a Podcast came around. Obviously I wanted to be involved in that. So we're editing and working on this podcast as well. And then when the podcast Blueprint course came out, we had all kind of learned this podcasting world through, trial and error together. So it was a cool opportunity to get involved with that as well. So all that being said, really deep, really deep into the podcast game now. It's become a big part of our business. So I now also co-host a podcast, which is a regional podcast with our Chamber of Commerce that we started. I guess we're 8 episodes in. I think we've got 12 recorded, something like that. So it's been a fun little journey, man.
Yeah, it's so cool to see all the stuff that you're involved with and how you've, you started doing this thing and then you're like, ooh, you know what? I can do more, and kind of just like jump for better or for worse, right? I can do more.
Right.
And you start taking these on. But, a cool thing. Yes. Now you mentioned that you host this one for, kind of your city, your county, kind of your area. But what's cool is Blake has seen what John and I have been able to do with our podcast. And didn't you, when you launched that one, you already launched it with a couple of sponsors and you're already getting paid before even one episode dropped?
Yeah, so it was a cool concept. And I urge anybody who's listening to this who is producing a podcast on their own, if you have the ability to do it, there's opportunity out there to go out and find companies. There are a lot of companies that want to have their own podcast. So we do several like that. But when we started the Chamber one, so I actually pitched this. We have a very large active Chamber of Commerce in the county in Texas that I live in. And a Chamber of Commerce's whole origin, most of these, they're nonprofits for the most part, but their whole business model is they're connecting, businesses together. So they're actively doing sponsorships, right? So if they do like a business after 5 meet and greet, cocktail hour where people can come in and pass out business cards and stuff, those are usually sponsored by a business. So we do video production for our local Chamber of Commerce, a lot of their marketing stuff. And I started to look at it and I thought, you already have the hardest part of a podcast done, right? And that's building the audience. So anybody who's done this or wants to do this knows that's definitely the most difficult part. Once you have the audience, you have everything. And they had like 5,000 followers, on Facebook. They had some subscribers on YouTube, and they had this already really captive audience. They had a Facebook group that had like 15,000 people in it already. Wow. They already had relationships with sponsors who were paying them, every month for different events. So they already had this exchange going on. So I presented to them and pitched this opportunity to do a podcast where I thought you said, you already have these relationships built. We could do sponsorships from day one based on, the experience that we have producing podcasts and what we've done. So we pitched that. And day one, we had a full book of sponsors day one. So we had a pre-roll, so 3 sponsors right out of the gate, 2 large regional hospitals, and a real estate office signed on as sponsors. So the very first episode we already had ad revenue coming in, which is fantastic and a really cool thing to have. But yeah, it's a cool deal. We're excited about it.
Man, that's incredible. And like if you're thinking of like the phrase riches in the niches and all that stuff, like you are a like super niche that most of the I'm going to say most of the country doesn't care what you're producing, and probably most of the state of Texas doesn't care what you're producing because it's so local, but yet you're still making a few $1,000s a month based on just being niche and knowing who your audience is and exactly who you want to reach. So man, that's so cool to hear all that.
Yeah, it's as small of a niche as you can get, really. And we always say that if you want to make a podcast about something, there's probably 5 of them already out there. Like there's a podcast about pretty much every topic you can imagine. But for us, like we know the podcast is never going to have 1 million subscribers. It's probably never going to have 100,000 subscribers. If we get to 50, that would blow my mind. I mean, we're marketing to a county that has 100,000 people in it. So, it would take every single one of the people in the county listening to the podcast, which is not going to happen, right? And we're also in rural East Texas, so technology can kind of be against us sometimes in that aspect. But, to kind of go back to what you guys say all the time on the podcast, there's value to that. Like these advertisers realize that, there's demographics that are listening to this, and it's just another avenue for them to advertise in. But yeah, it's been a cool learning experience. I think I've texted John and you several times because I had edited hundreds of episodes of podcasts before I had ever actually sat down and hosted one on my own. Had obviously listened to an ungodly number of hours of podcast.
Sure.
And there were certain situations that like I would sit down and text the two of you like, oh my goodness, hosting is so much harder than I had realized, juggling what you're thinking, what you're about to say, what this person's about to say. Sometimes we have multiple people on the podcast trying to make it not boring and interesting. It's been an interesting experience for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So last week, Blake actually traveled with me. We went to Denver, Colorado, and I got to speak. John and I got to speak, and Blake did too, actually, a little bit at this wedding video conference. It actually did happen in Denver. Everyone was really safe. We wore masks. All of the speakers got tested, before we went to make sure we were negative. But one of the things that we did was we hosted a live podcast. So there were the 10 presenters, speakers that were there, and then this room full of 35 people or whatever. And I remember a couple of times, like I'm sitting there talking, and like I don't know the words that are coming out of my mouth, and so it's like it's kind of embarrassing whenever that happens. Just me and you or me and John or something. Actually,
Right.
when it happens with John, it doesn't bother me anymore. Whatever. But whenever you have a room full of these 10 people that you really respect in your industry, and a room full of 30 people that are watching you, and you like totally flub up. I guess that that's really on brand for me a little bit, but yeah, definitely. There is so much that goes into hosting a podcast, from the production side to if you want to monetize it to being a good host and a good interviewer. Like it's just there's so much with it. And one of the things that we really wanted to do today on the podcast was just let us answer some of your questions. So I went into our Facebook group. If you are on Facebook and you want to check that out, just search for How to Make a Podcast. And I just had people ask a bunch of different questions. What are things that you're interested in? What do you want us to talk about? And so this episode, Blake and I are going to try to tackle some of your questions, and we will do that right after this break.
If you have a pulse, you probably hate the subject of taxes and running the bookkeeping portion of your business. But like it or not, if you want to be a successful podcaster, you are going to have to pay attention to your numbers. But don't worry, we have the answer for you, Core Financial. Our friends over at Core Financial have taken the pressure off of us so we can focus on what we love doing most, running our podcast. They take care of all of our taxes, monthly bookkeeping, financial plans, and make sure we take full advantage of all of the tax benefits we qualify for. It just feels good knowing we aren't going to get a big surprise during tax season. If you are serious about building a business with your podcast, head on over to howtomakeapodcast.co/core to see what they can do for you.
So you've got everything you need for your podcast. You've recorded your audio and video. You're so excited, but wait, you don't know how to master the audio or edit the video of your podcast. We know someone who can help. The podcast editors. Picture this. You record both audio and video for your podcast. You upload it to your remote editor, and a few days later, your podcast is ready for you to upload and push to the world. What will you do with your extra time? Connect with sponsors? Grow your Facebook group? Start that project or even course you have dreamed of for months? The possibilities are endless. We are blown away by the podcast editors and love working with them and using their services. They can edit audio, video, or both for your podcast. Don't get stuck trying to do this on your own. Get in touch with the podcast editors today. If you'd like to save 50% off of your first project, head over to howtomakeapodcast.co/thepodcasteditors. Okay, we are back from break with our friend Blake Pollino, who edits our podcasts, who is involved in podcasts all over the place, whether it's listening to them or editing them. And we are going to go ahead and jump into our question of the day presented by Zencast. If you need a place to host your podcast, we highly recommend Zencast. It is who we use. We love them. They are a great hosting service for your podcast. And so, again, earlier, Blake, I said that we just opened up our Facebook group and we asked who has some questions. And Noble Gibbons asked a ton of questions, but one that I wanted to kind of touch on to kind of go off, jump into this Q&A. This will be our question of the day. What podcast metrics are important to study and analyze? What do you think? What are you looking for as someone who, runs a podcast and thinking? What are metrics that you're looking for?
Yeah, this is one I really wanted to make sure we answer, because I want to say first, it's so easy to get paralysis by analysis with all of the data and all of the metrics that are out there. And it's also really easy to get caught up on like wanting to check, like refreshing and constantly check those metrics, constantly to see how many downloads you have and, what episodes are going good. And that'll drive you crazy. I mean, just coming from the content side of even not podcasting, some of the stuff that we do, the video stuff and everything else, it's so easy to get caught up on how many YouTube subscribers we have, or how many views this video has, or how many likes this video has. And we're like training ourselves for that little dopamine rush, right, that you get whenever you see that. So first off, and the reason I want to answer this question was, I think it's really important to not get super caught up in those numbers. The reality of it is they're great numbers to share with sponsors, and it's good data to be able to share with them once you get to a level that you have sponsors if you're not already. But leading up to that, just make good content, right? Like just make the content that you would want to listen to and let that follow, let that community build around the thing that you've built. Because if you're trying to create it based on those numbers, like if you're looking at an episode and judging it based on how that episode does, and then that changes the way that you're making your content going forward, you're going to be in for a really, really bad and really stressful time doing that. But to actually talk about the numbers that you should be looking at, so you definitely want to look at obviously your downloads. So I mean that's going to be the biggest one is seeing those downloads and getting a good picture of what those look like over the long term. I know with How to Film Weddings, we've done that and look at what works and what doesn't work, but we do that at a high level, right? So we're giving it enough time for it to breathe and it to grow and for it to do its own thing organically, and not like dive into every single episode and be like, oh, did this work? Or, oh, did this not work? But when we like really scale back on it, when we look at 100+ episodes, we can see, wow, this really worked. Like when we look at the stuff that people really responded to, it was really obvious what worked. And so we try to replicate that. And that's what I would look at.
This is one time where I wish that the podcast metrics were better, because when it comes to something like YouTube, one of the things that's great about YouTube, and again, this is not YouTube is not a podcasting platform, right? It is a video platform. But a lot of people do put their podcasts on there because, everyone has access to YouTube. But an analytic that you can look at is retention rate on YouTube. And so, like, if you do upload your videos, to YouTube, and you can see that after 30 seconds, you are losing over half of your audience or a ton of your audience, then that's going to tell you something. Right?
Yep.
Now, again, if you are uploading a picture and just talking, like there isn't video, like this right now is a video on YouTube, which is a lot better. It's going to help whet that retention rate. So if you're uploading just a picture and speaking, I'm guessing that your retention rate on YouTube is going to drop really quickly because of that, because people want to see something. So I wish there was something like that for actual podcast, the downloads and checking all of that. So, I agree 100% with everything that you say. You cannot get bogged down with it. If you are continually refreshing on launch day and trying to get it over and over and over again, like it's just going to drive you crazy. Yeah. John and I typically, we check our, like on launch days, we'll check in maybe at lunchtime and maybe time before we go to bed just to kind of see how the numbers are going. There have been times actually where I have gone like 2 weeks and I just forgotten to look at the numbers, with it, because we've been doing it for a while and I know that we're pretty consistent. The thing that if you are going to look at if you're going to analyze your data, something to look at is compare yourself to yourself. Okay. Yep. You're hearing John and I on this podcast saying how, actually, earlier this month on our How to Film Weddings one, we hit 200,000 all-time downloads in right at 2 years, which is an amazing accomplishment. But you might hear that and you're thinking, man, I have been doing this for, 5 months and I have 500 downloads. Like what, and you can just get depressed and bogged down. But if you look at, you have 500 downloads in 5 months, but in month 5, you had 300 downloads where you only had 200 from the first 4 months. Okay, now you're starting to trend in that right direction. So if you're looking at that data, and now if you are approaching sponsors, you can say, hey, listen, I have, grown this month I've grown over, 200% in the last, month alone. You can use the data without lying, that sort of thing. So I'd just be careful with that. I know we're so bogged down in the numbers and we care so much about those numbers, but if you are producing quality, great content that comes back to your topic, your niche, your thing over and over again, then people will catch on to that. And if your content is quality, and people aren't listening, then probably you have a distribution problem, not a podcast problem, right? Yep. So you just need to figure out how to get the right people to that audience. So, do anything you want to add, or I answered it. I answered it perfectly.
You answered it perfect. I do want to talk about that YouTube thing you mentioned right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So, every single one of our podcasts that we produce, we also produce in video form. So we don't produce any podcasts that are just audio. And what you talked about with YouTube is a really important reason for that. First off, search engine optimization. Like having your podcast on YouTube is just going to rank your podcast higher on Google across the board just because it's there. So that's the number one. If you had no other reason at all, it would be worth it. Like if no one watched the podcast, and we have some podcasts that we produce that some they'll get like less than 100 views on YouTube, or some will get like 10 or 15, and that's totally fine. Like we're not expecting, it boggles my mind sometimes that people will sit there and watch an hour-long podcast of two people sitting in a chair talking, but some people want to watch it that way, and that's fine. But a great part about it is you do get to analyze using YouTube's analytics for your podcast, because those metrics are not there. Sometimes we'll borrow especially on the bigger podcasts that have a lot of views. It's kind of hard to extrapolate that when there's only like 15 on a YouTube. But once you're kind of getting up in the hundreds, you can start to see like, oh, hey, we saw a lot of drop off because we had an ad right here. Let's adjust that and move it around. So I just wanted to piggyback on that. That's a really, really good reason to have your stuff on YouTube.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. That's why one of the reasons why we do it. Totally. But again, if video is not, if you're not ready for that yet, we don't recommend jumping in and doing video until you are ready for it, because it is just just another animal that you have to deal with.
It is whole other beast.
Whole nother beast. So Blake, was there a question on here that you were interested in talking about for a sec?
Yeah, so there's a couple of other good ones we'll jump in. So the next one here is and this kind of piggybacks off of what we just talked about, but what social platforms are the best to market your podcast, to get your podcast out there? What do you think?
I'm going to say all of them. Is that kind of a cop-out? No, we were actually talking about that a little bit in break, but for our podcast, our belief is that we need to go where our listeners are. And so for wedding videographers are on Facebook. They are not really on Twitter. Okay, right. For whatever reason, our profession is not on Twitter. So I think we have a How to Film Weddings Twitter, but I'm pretty sure the last time we tweeted anything was like 2 years ago, because we just know that our audience isn't there. So you need to find where your audience is. I know depending on your topic and your niche, Twitter is going to be a big place for a lot of podcasters. So maybe it's there. Reddit is something that I have never really jumped into, but I know that there are a lot of people that are on Reddit, and especially if you have something like a tech podcast, Reddit might be like right up your alley where you need to be to form your community. TikTok is growing and it's not going anywhere. So you could, that could be a place where you could go. Obviously, I think Facebook and Instagram are going to be the biggest ones. Again, the bad thing about both Facebook and Instagram is they are pay-to-play platforms. So if you really want to make the most impact, to get the most viewers, listeners, downloads for your podcast, and you're only on Facebook and you're only on Instagram, you're going to have to pay if you want to reach a broader audience. That's simply how it is. I think with a Facebook page, organically, you only reach 3 to 5% of your followers. So if you have 100 people that are following you, only 3 people are seeing that post organically. Okay, so you need to have some other way to go about that. Just things you need to know. What do you have to add that I didn't say?
I think you totally crushed it on that. But especially what you said at the beginning, it's figuring out where your market is. there's a really good book I want to recommend and plug if you haven't already read it. It's called This Is Marketing by Seth Godin. It's fantastic. And that's one of the things he talks about. Like, marketing has gone from, plaster your business everywhere and hope that people see it with the shotgun approach to figuring it out where your market already is and going to that place. So, yeah, definitely. If you have a younger demographic that skews younger, maybe you need to be on TikTok. Maybe you need to be posting little blurbs from your podcast on the old TikTok or Instagram or Twitter or whatever's going to come next.
And this is another reason why we have spent, like John and I, one of the reasons that we've been able to grow our podcast is we have paid for advertising. We have, now we haven't necessarily specifically advertised specific podcast episodes, but we are advertising on Facebook to get people into our Facebook group. And then that's kind of where we're pushing a bunch of our information is in our Facebook groups. So I think that if you want to use Facebook and you can start to get some traction creating a Facebook group, we've recorded episodes on that. That's a huge tool that we use because the algorithms, if the group is active, the algorithms play in your favor with a Facebook group. If you can really get it up and going and have lots of interaction and stuff in there. Now, if you have a Facebook group and no one's in it and no one's talking, like, it's not going to do you any good. So that's another way we have found a lot of success. So I think we're kind of running close to time here for today. Answered a couple questions. We will next week's episode. I'm going to have Blake back on. And we're going to just answer a few more of your questions. But I want to close with this one, which, people as they're getting into podcasting or thinking about doing it, I think this one comes up. And Rebecca asked this question. Do you use a script when having a guest on your podcast, or do you free flow and improv? What do you do for, you're interviewing your chamber people? Like, what's kind of your approach with that?
Yeah, so I don't really know anybody that uses a script for the podcast. It just comes off as really robotic. None of the podcasts that we produce, that we do, none of our friends in podcasting that we know of do. It just comes off as really robotic and disingenuous. Is that a word? It doesn't come across as authentic, right? So one of the things that we do is for some of our interviews, we'll send them notes. We'll send them questions sometimes that will allow them to pre-prepare. And I'll give you an example of one. So when we first started off, we were interviewing small business owners who are successful in the community, local community leaders, and we wanted to kind of like distill down advice from them to give to our audience, which most of our audience are entrepreneurial, they're small business owners, or they're aspiring small business owners in the community, or business leaders, things like that. So we wanted to like pull down little pieces, nuggets of information from these people. And one of the questions that I had on the podcast was, what's the best book that you've read recently, or the book that you recommend most often? And I think I had like 3 guests in a row where I just got deer in the headlights, like right in the middle of the recording, like, I have no idea. Like, they just weren't prepared, for that question. So we'll make a kind of a list of questions so that they can kind of look over them, prepare, and know kind of what to say. And then we like to obviously have a good mix of questions that they're not prepared for, just because we want to have that, authentic and organic, real conversation. It's very conversational. Like, nobody wants to listen to something that's, super scripted and not real, outside of the narrative style of podcasts. Sure. And, that kind of stuff. But for what we do, for what most people do, the interview style of podcasting, I don't really think anybody would want to listen to this kind of pre-written stuff. But yeah, definitely let it free flow and be real with it.
Yeah. So the exact same thing. So what we do when we have guests on our podcast is, we have a questionnaire that we're sending them. And one of the things that we will ask them is, what are things that you feel very comfortable discussing? So, on our wedding film podcast, if we have someone who is really, really good at color grading, we're not going to ask them a whole bunch of questions about marketing or something like that whenever that's really not their wheelhouse. Okay. Yep. So that's really helpful. And then you can kind of develop your questions kind of tailored around those subjects. But if they give you a list of things that they feel very competent in and feel like an expert on, that will definitely help you with that. When it comes to writing a script, I can't think of any podcast, unless it's like a dramatization, right?
Yeah.
That have
radio hour
scripted, right? That have a scripted podcast when it's more than one person. I can't think of anything like that. I do know that Jenna Kutcher, for her, because she does 2 a week, she has one where she interviews someone and then another one where it's just her. I know her solo ones, they are very, very scripted. I don't know if it's actually word for word, if it's really, really bullet pointed or however. So if you're by yourself, writing some sort of script, writing an outline that's a little more tight and concise so that you know where to go and what to talk about and you don't ramble a lot, that can be really, really helpful. But having an outline with a guest, and then another thing I always recommend when it comes to guests is listen to what they have to say. Okay,
Right.
So if you are interviewing someone and they say something really, really interesting and you get this idea, it's like, oh, I want to ask them this follow-up question, but it's not in my notes. And you decide to stick to your notes. I think that will end up hurting your podcast in the long run if you continue to run like that. So one of the great things about being a really good interviewer is being a really great listener. So listen to what they say, hone in on some of the things that they have, that they've shared with you, and then maybe do up a follow-up question. Now, it doesn't always lead to more answers, but whenever you're focused on what they're saying rather than just what you want to ask next, you can create a lot better content.
Totally. Another thing that we'll do that's been really successful is we'll ask them, because we've had some politicians on and things where they have to be really careful with what they say. And we started it with one of those where they actually sent us a list of questions that we could ask them, and that kind of gave us the idea to continue doing that, to send out these email like, hey, are there any questions you want us to ask? Because that will uncover, even if we don't ask it in that way or even at that exact question, it'll give us some really interesting routes or little roads that we can go down and talk about.
Yeah, that's a really neat idea. So my recommendation, whenever you have a guest on, unless it's just meant to be kind of a, hey, we're just going to talk for an hour kind of podcast. I know there's those out there like that. Kind of make some sort of outline or docket or something where you can kind of go off of. If it's not someone regular, get them, say, what do you want to talk about? Do you have questions that you want me to ask, et cetera, et cetera? So, hey, really, really great questions. And guys, we have a ton more questions that we would love to answer. We have dozens of questions that we would love to answer with you, to you, for you. I don't know the right words for this. Sorry about that. But we are going to jump on more of this next week. In next week's podcast, I'm going to have Blake back on here and we are going to answer more of your questions. So we thank you so much for listening. If you are at home and you are listening to this and you want to get better audio in your podcast, we want to let you know that we have just released a new product called Audio Enhancement. You just go to our shop, you can pick that up, and you can learn. I walk you through both Audition, Audacity, and GarageBand on simple things that you can do to tweak and enhance your audio to make it sound better in your podcasts. Again, Blake, it has been such a pleasure having you on our show this week. And until next time, we will see ya.
See ya.